The data source for our translator application is going to be a dictionary. Now in a production scenario, we would use a local database such as SQLite or maybe an Azure mobile app. But that is something we can add later. Right now, I just want to focus on the core functions of the app. So this dictionary is going to be keyed on strings, and the values are going to be strings as well. Also, I'm going to wrap it in a static class that's going to provide access, so there's going to be a singleton. To get started, let's create a new C# class and call it shared list. Since we'll be using the dictionary class, I'm going to pull in the generic collections namespace. And then in the class, I'm going to add a private static instance of the dictionary, keyed on a string with values of strings. I'm going to call it _items, and I'm going to set it equal to null. Now, I'm not going to need this constructor, so I can delete it. And then I'm going to create a public static instance, or a public static property rather, of the same type as items, and I'm going to call it items. This is going to be read-only, so I'm only going to need to have a getter. And inside the getter, the first thing I'm going to do is check to see if the private dictionary is equal to null. If it is, I'm going to add some data to it. And then it returns the private dictionary. So this ensures that the dictionary will be initialized only once, which is the first time that the items property is accessed. So the last thing I'm going to do here is add a public static method that will take a key and a value and add those to the dictionary. Now to set this up as the data source for the table view, if you're familiar with iOS development, you've likely used the UI table view data source protocol. And that is accessible in Xamarin too, although it's implemented as an interface. But Xamarin has created an abstract class to use as a base class for a table view data source and recommends you do it this way instead. And I'm going to follow that pattern. So I'm going to create a new C# class, and I'm going to call it translator data source. I'm going to bring in the UI kit namespace, and then I'm going to derive from UI table view source. Now this red squiggly under the class means that we have not implemented some required methods. So to fix this, I'll right click and then select Fix, Implement Abstract Class from the pop-up. This is going to stub out the required methods, rows in section and get cell. The table view will call these methods when it needs to get data. The rows in section method simply returns the number of rows in a section of a table view. Tables can be grouped into cells where each group represents a section. Then each row in the section has a number that, along with the section number, uniquely identifies it within the table. The section and row number are contained in something called an index path. There's also an optional number of sections method, which we can see here. However, I'm not going to need to override this because we only have one section, and the default implementation of number of sections is to return 1. And since we've only got one section, we can ignore the section parameter in rows in section and just return the number of items in the shared list. Now to the getCell method. This is what the table view calls to get the data for a particular cell. The first thing we want to do is to try to reuse an existing cell that is not on the screen. Now, as powerful as iOS devices are, they have limited resources compared to desktop and laptop computers. So if you have a list with hundreds of items, it would be a waste to create cells for all of them when only 10 or so or at a time might be shown. So to solve this, iOS will take a cell that is not being displayed on the screen and mark it as reusable. Then we can use this method DQ reusable cell to try to get an unused cell with a particular identifier. Now the identifier represents which prototype we want to use. Different types of data can use different prototypes in different layouts. And in this case, I've only got one cell, so I'm just going to use a generic identifier of cell view. And then also, this method wants the index path, which is passed into the getCell method. Now it's possible that there are no reusable cells available, in which case DQ reusable cell will return null. So I need to first check to make sure, see if cell is null, and then if it is, I can just create a new UI table view cell. And UI table view cell wants a cell style, which represents a layout. In this case, I'm just going to use this subtitle layout, and then also the reuse identifier so that it can be reused later on, in which case I'll use cell view again. Now after this, we are guaranteed to have a cell, so I can take the text label property of that cell and set its text to something, and then return the cell. However, what we want to do is we want to be returning the keys to the dictionary in the shared list. So what I need to do first is I need to get those keys. And to do this, I'm going to need to pull in the collections class again. What I'll do is I'll use a list of strings and I'll pass it the keys in the shared list. Now what I want to do is I want to get the particular key for the row that was tapped, and that's going to be found in the index path. Now since the index path has the section and the row, but again, since we've only got one section, we could ignore the section and just go with the row name. So what I can do now is I can say var key equals keys and use the row as the index into the keys. Now what I can do is I can just set the text to that key and return it. So that's all we need in the data source. Next we need to tell the table about it. So in the English View Controller class, in ViewDidLoad, the table view for the UI table view controller is represented by this table view property, and it has a source method, which we can then set to an instance of translator data source. Now there's one last thing that we need to do, which is let the table view in the storyboard know that it has a prototype with an identifier of cell view. So in the storyboard up here in this area, this is where the prototype cell is. So if you click on it, it'll be highlighted. And then over here in the properties pane, you can see that there's an identifier section, and just give it an identifier of cell view. And that's everything we need to test it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it again. And the table view comes up with the list of English words in it. Great. So now it's time to create the view controller for the translated word and set up the segue to display that.